Well. Hello. Happy New Year. Today is New Year's Eve. So good to see all of you here today. Welcome to the Jaybefaunt channel. I'm your host, James Fauntleroy. So good to see you, all of you. The Jaybefaunt channel is also available on all major podcast platforms like Anchor, Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Subscribe to me there. I'm also part of the Revolutionary Blackout Network, so you can catch me on Sundays at 1 on RBN. Also on RBN Live on Tuesdays at 4, and the Sabby and JB Show on Thursdays at 6. You can also catch me on this channel regularly on Tuesdays at 2. You can see me doing a live stream. If you are new or just want to push this out into the algorithm a little bit more, please make sure to give me a thumbs up. As well as thank you to all the patrons on Patreon, Coffee, the members, as well as anybody who sends me mutual aid via various platforms. I just want to express my heartfelt thank you from the top and bottom of my hearts. So good to see all of you here today. Now, Dirty Truths. The last reading of Dirty Truths for 2022 is here. We're going to be covering Chapter 5 with Professor Dr. Michael Parenti. Chapter 5, Miscellany and Memorabilia. This is what we're covering today. Struggles in Academia, a personal account. So we're going to be talking about his struggles in trying to get into the role of academia. This is a very interesting one because it actually talks about his history and why many people in academia saw him as problematic, especially within this system. And this is one of the reasons why we can regard Michael Parenti as a badass. You guys are going to enjoy this one. This is going to be really good, and I'm actually really excited to get into this. So without further ado, starting on page 235 on Dirty Truths by Michael Parenti, Chapter 5, Part 1. Let's get into it. Amidst the cornfields of central Illinois, there stands a congestion of graceless black buildings known as the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, UI. Their story begins in the spring of 1970 during the Vietnam War when I was visiting an associate professor at the UI campus. Repression in Illinois. Save for a few peace marches, there had been little anti-war activity at UI until one day in early March 1970 when some 200 people demonstrated against General Electric recruitment team that was conducting job interviews on campus. Several of the protesters were beaten and arrested by police while attempting to force their way into the building. A few hours later, it was announced that the Board of Trustees had voted in an emergency session to bar William Kunstler, one of the few defense attorneys at the Chicago 7 conspiracy trial, for speaking on the campus. In the eyes of many students, the university was revealing the true nature of its commitments. A corporation like GE, with its extensive involvement of the war machine, was being granted privileged access to the campus for recruitment purposes, while Kunstler and his audience were denied their rights to an open forum. Angered by the actions of the police and the trustees, a crowd of more than 1,000 took to the streets that evening, blocking traffic, stoning the windows of several of the more overpriced and unpopular campus stores, as well as the windows of the administration building and the armory buildings where ROTC was housed. This was followed by 2 more nights of demonstrations, rallies, and minor trashing. Yes, GE, General Electric. There was a point where GE, I think they owned NBC and Universal. I think a couple of years back, it was probably about 6, maybe 7 years back, where GE was the parent company of NBC. Interesting, right? A curfew was enforced with numerous arrests and much unnecessary police brutality. Students caught in the streets after curfew were chased and clubbed by police in what looked at times like a primitive rabbit hunt. From the window of a campus building, I witnessed a young woman beaten over the head and then dragged, apparently unconscious, to a police car. In the days to follow, it was a cause of dismay to some of us that UI Chancellor Jack Peltison, later to serve the powers that be as president of the University of California, issued statements of praise for the police, undiluted by a single critical or restraining word. For the next 2 months, the administration weeded out the activist students, many of whom had not been arrested in the March disturbances but were known to be radicals. In violation of the university's own procedure, the chancellor bypassed the faculty student committee that had been established to deal with disciplinary cases and invited a prominent Illinois lawyer, whose firm was on retainer with the university, to preside as an ostensibly disinterested investigator over suspension hearings involving some 40 students. Other measures were taken in the name of security. The campus police, notoriously inept at protecting students from the many robberies, assaults, and rapes that plagued the campus community, devoted their main efforts to protecting the UI administration from its own populace. Remind you of the police, just in general. Elaborate and detailed dossiers were kept on hundreds of students and scores of faculty members. News clippings in which one's name appeared in association with a controversial issue, statements one made at public or organizational meetings as reported by police agents, photographs documenting one's presence at a rally, teach-in, or demonstration. Such were kinds of things to be found in an individual's campus security file. The campus police knew the names and faces of the troublemakers and of many others who would have been surprised to discover themselves deserving such attention. For weeks after the March events, university police were busy taking snapshots of people on campus, issuing suspension warrants, and filing complaints in criminal court. Scores of students were arrested, held on bail, then released. In most cases, charges were dropped months later for lack of evidence, indicating that the purpose of the arrest was intimidation, not prosecution. After being released, some students were arrested a second and third time in their homes or dormitories on vaguely stated charges. This reminds me of the George Floyd protests back in the summer of 2020. There were a lot of that because they just didn't want people to speak out and garner that much attention. And the powers that be basically used the police to shut people up. That's really what it was, an intimidation tactic. So that people won't say, well, I don't want to get in trouble ever again by police, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. That's how they do it. That's why so many people are afraid of speaking out now. A killing and a beating. Not long after this reign of repression seemed to have run its course, President Nixon invaded Cambodia. National Guardsmen killed 4 Kent State students, and a day later, a local Champaign police officer killed an African-American man named Edgar Holtz. From all evidence, Holtz, a bookstore employee, was innocent of any crime except driving without a license and DWB, driving while black. Holtz made the mistake of taking flight when police approached his car and was shot in the back without warning. The culpable officer was indicted for voluntary manslaughter, later reduced to involuntary manslaughter, released on $5,000 bond, and eventually found not guilty by an all-white Middle American jury. On the evening after Holt's murder and the Kent State killings, a crowd of more than 3,000 attended a rally called by student leaders. Several students and faculty, including myself, spoke in support of an immediate strike to protest Cambodia, Kent State, the Holtz murder, police brutality, and the presence of ROTC and the Iliac 4 Pentagon supercomputer on campus. The next day, May 16, 1970, the strike gathered momentum. Pickets appeared in front of major buildings and thousands of students boycotted classes. So this is direct action basically taking place. You could guess what happens next. That afternoon, I joined a group of students and faculty who were standing in Service driveway arguing with campus police. It seemed the police had ordered a garbage truck to be backed into a crowd of striking students without making any efforts to clear the driveway. What does this remind you of? Does this remind you of police squad cars driving over protesters? Doesn't it remind you of that? Yeah, this happened in 1970. Luckily, no one had been hurt. The exchange ended with approximately 50 club-swinging state troopers charged the crowd without warning. Several students were knocked down. Others were pushed into the shrubbery. One had his front teeth bashed out by police club. I was clubbed full force over my left eye and on the back of my head. After being knocked to the ground, I was clubbed in the legs and kicked and beaten on the back, chest, and neck by state troopers. A colleague and close friend of mine, the late Philip Moranto, raced into a knot of police surrounding me, shouting at them to leave me alone. Professor Moranto threw himself onto me in a courageous attempt to absorb some of the punishment, only to be dragged off, kicked, and held face down in the driveway. While the crowd was restrained by troopers and university police, Moranto and I were handcuffed and driven to the campus police station, along with several students arrested in the same incident. I was held without medical care for approximately 1 hour. My face, head, and neck was soaked with my own blood. Outside the station, a crowd of about 1,000 angry students faced a ring of police armed with shotguns. In the adjacent hallway, I heard an officer say, quote, "If I had gotten the clean first lick of that fella, me, he'd be a dead man now." End quote. 3 men in plain clothes, standing more directly in my view, began conversation in a low but audible tones. I heard one remark excitedly, quote, "That's Parenti, the one who made the speech last night. Now the chancellor will want us to throw the book at him." End quote. A moment later, a man entered the room to examine my wounds. He began questioning me, making a great show of friendly concern. His inquiries invited inquiries of my own, and he eventually admitted to me that he was not a doctor, but an FBI agent. In response to my refusal to provide him with any details, he made a point of saying, quote, "That's okay. We know all about you, Michael John," end quote. The use of my middle name doubtless was intended to impress me with the intimacy of his knowledge. Eventually, I was taken to the hospital where I received 12 stitches on my face and head and x-rays for internal injuries. I was then transported to state jail, booked, fingerprinted, and held in a cell for some 30 sleepless hours with my head burning and my body shivering, without knowledge of the charges against me, and having been denied repeated requests to see a doctor. I was released the next day on a $10,000 bond by the same judge who had placed only a $5,000 bond on the policeman who had killed Edgar Holtz. Much to my surprise, I was charged with 5 counts, including aggravated battery. A state trooper testified during my preliminary hearing that I had chipped his tooth with my hand. Earlier, he had reported to university officials that I had struck them with a hard object. On a later occasion, he said he was hit by a fist Whatever his claims, I and other eyewitnesses knew his story to be either a fabrication or a case of mistaken identity. Professor Moranto, who had been arrested with me, was arrested again the next day while appearing in court for his arraignment. The same state trooper told the court that Moranto's knee had brushed against his leg. Oh. A complaint of aggravated battery was filed against Moranto, and he too was released under $10,000 bond by the same judge. Needless to say, Chancellor Jack Peltison offered no assistance to the two of us who have been beaten, kicked, arrested, and falsely charged. He had not called for an investigation of the incident to ascertain whether justice had been done. He made no effort to determine whether his security officers were dangerous fools in ordering the garbage truck to back into a crowd of students. In fact, it was his office that filed the complaints against Moranto and me. On the day of our release, Pettleson announced to the press that the status of our positions at the university were under review. In glowing terms, he voiced confidence in a security officer who had so determinedly protected the rights of a garbage truck. Students were demanding that the officer be fired. Wow. Just goes to show how they are. Rallies and purges. The beatings and arrests further galvanized students. As at Columbia, Harvard, and elsewhere, great numbers seemed ready to set aside their political differences and close ranks when their own people were being attacked by police. In response to the beatings and arrests, some 10,000 students, faculty, and community people rallied the next day. Most seemed intent upon violating that evening's curfew, despite the presence of the National Guard's contingent, an act of defiance that moved civil authorities to lift the curfew. The strike, now involving the great majority of students, continued for the next week or so, replete with pickets, demonstrations, liberated classes, and over 100 more arrests and numerous beatings by the club-happy, lawless forces of law and order. During the strike, 15 political scientists formed a Faculty for Resistance and promulgated a statement condemning President Nixon, the Cambodian invasion, the Vietnam War, the Kent State killings, the systematic murder of Black militants, and the increasing repression of dissent. They vowed to devote their time and teaching students how to intellectually arm and protect themselves from, quote, the encroachments of a criminal regime, end quote. These events were followed by the usual threats and retributions. Some graduate students who had been active in the strike found themselves faced with loss of fellowships and teaching assistantships. At least 2 teaching assistants were dismissed outright. Philip Moranto, who previously had been assured of tenure and promotion because of his teaching abilities and publications, and whose only crimes were being an outspoken radical critic and trying to protect a colleague from physical harm, was informed that he would be wise to begin searching for a new position. At the same time, young instructors in various departments were informed that any future strike activities will be grounds for cancellation of contract. Chancellor Pettleson sent a letter asking all department heads to have their faculty account for their time during the week of the strike. This reminds me about Dr. Cornel West, how he was denied tenure, I think, at Harvard because of his stance on how Palestinians were being treated in Gaza by Israeli forces. And so he resigned because they refused to give him tenure. Even though he's quite prominent. And he's quite regarded as a prolific and very impressive professor. In a letter to me, Peddleson stated that the allegations against me, which he presumed to be true, were grounds for dismissal, but since I was soon departing anyway, he decided that a report of the entire matter was to be placed in my permanent record and file and made available to my university public to any university, public agency, or prospective employer wanting information on me. He also informed me that for the duration of my stay, he would see that I be reassigned to the extent necessary to eliminate any further interaction with students in my teaching or research functions. In response, I informed him that I dislike being judged guilty on a matter pending before the courts, that the threat to make a dossier available to other prospective employers savored of blacklisting, and that any attempt to interfere with my interaction with students would further infringe on my civil liberties. In the weeks after the strike, I found myself undergoing a trial by newspaper and radio. One local talk show kept referring to that violent Professor Parenti who stuffed a brick in a policeman's face and who stirred up the students to riot. Moranto and I were informed by a sympathetic news reporter that we were on an elimination list compiled by a coterie of local police and that we had better take precautions. Two students also reported separate conversations they had with campus police who spoke of their intent to get Parenti. Another student reported that campus cop had told him that Parenti had a Swiss bank account containing secret funds from the Russians and Chinese. Oh, God. Does that remind you of right now? Anytime it's talked about anything leftist, oh, you're a Russian plant, or you're a Russian bot, or you're working with the Russians, something like that, right? Doesn't that remind you of now? This is exactly what they're doing. And they typically use a foreign power to be the boogeyman just so that we would team up and fight against people who are literally looking out for our best interests. Meanwhile, this was before the fall of the Soviet Union. So Russia was still a socialist state. And the United States was hell-bent on taking down the socialist state because they saw socialism as the primary competition against them regarding capitalism. Facing possible imprisonment because of a marijuana charge, one student reluctantly had accepted the FBI's offer to monitor all my campus speaking engagements in exchange for having the charges against him dropped. This is also what they do. They will pit people who are sympathetic of us against us in order for them to get themselves out of trouble. And so then they get spooked and scared into going up against us or someone who may be on the left who's fighting against the system in order to save themselves. And so that's how they do it. Just so that you can have more leniency with the government. It's sad, but they're dirty in the way they do things. Troubled by the whole thing, he later asked his roommate to tell me about it. For the first 2 weeks after the strike, whenever Moranto and I were either driving or walking together, we found ourselves trailed by police. One evening during the strike, a patrol car followed me home and then staked out directly in front of my house for the entire night. I left via a backyard path under the cover of darkness and spent several days at a friend's house. The mother of the friend of mine was visited at her Chicago residence by FBI agents who unsettled her with the information that her daughter was in the company of a dangerous revolutionary who was being kept under constant surveillance. They volunteered speculations about the nature of her daughter's relationship with me. See how they do? The political scientists who signed the Faculty of Resistance statement in the spring of 1970 did not fare too well. A Chicago Tribune editorial called for the dismissal, accusing them of being academic vipers, guilty of unprofessional, unethical conduct and academic incompetence. Soon afterward, a state senator took up the cry, and the UI Board of Trustees demanded that 15 retract their statement or face further action. One board member suggested that their classes be monitored. Two of the original signers wrote a forewarning conciliatory letter that the trustees were pleased to accept. The remaining 13 were sent clarifying but uncompromising response, and the trustees voted unanimously to rebuke them for using such terms in their original statement as official racism, present societal madness, and systemic elimination of Black militants and a criminal regime. I'm going to read that again. A remaining 13 sent a clarifying but uncompromising response, and the trustees voted unanimously to rebuke them for using such terms in their original statement as official racism, present societal madness, and systemic elimination of Black militants and a criminal regime. One trustee called it anarchist language. All agreed that the 13 were guilty of descriptions of this country that did not reflect, quote, the standards of scholarly and professional expression. That's civility politics. That is civility politics that they're using in order to stifle dissent. See what they do? See what they do? It's even at the university and college level. So when people who are on the right go, oh my God, these are super liberal and left spaces and they're trying to bog down on the left. No, they're not. Bro, they've been doing this for forever. For damn near 50 years. God. Ooh, these people, I'm telling you. Thus did the business executives, corporate lawyers, and successful speculators and investors who composed of the UI Board of Trustees become self-appointed arbiters of what the faculty could say about socio-political conditions in the United States. So really, it's the PMCs that are really the Board of Trustees, the professional managerial class, that determine what and who can say what people can say and who can be within these universities. This is why you don't have a lot of people that are truly on the left in a lot of these colleges, because if they are, then the Board of Trustees do not want them there. Even if the student and faculty want them there, the Board of Trustees don't, because they're gate kept out of it. They're locked out. It's crazy. So when people on the right talk about, oh well, the left is dominate the college atmosphere, no, they don't. No, they don't. They don't. That's not true. It's easier for you to be far right and in college than it is for you to be on the left. You get regarded more, basically. Okay. Repressive measures extended beyond the boundaries of University of Illinois. One of the 13 singers, one of the 13 signers considered too controversial was turned down for a job at Purdue University. One UI political science graduate student applying for teaching position at Indiana State College was informed by the department chair that the school's administration already had rejected two applicants because of their radical propensities, and that no interviews could be arranged with any radical or SDS types. Another graduate student provided me with a written account of his job hunting experience. I quote from his letter. From first to last item of highest priority was student issues, the complaints they were raising, and the trouble they caused. Of much less importance were my qualifications for the position. Since I generally found myself at odds with my questioners about the major topics at hand, and since I wanted the job, I tried to balance diplomacy and honesty with little success. Feigning ignorance of the facts or little concern about the problem partially accomplished the former. Trying to show empathy, as opposed to agreement, with the students partially accomplished the latter. Naturally, the result of all this was an unsettling feeling that I had sold out, but not enough. Another job seeker reflected on his experiences. Quote, at one place, I was asked a continuous barrage of questions about student disorders and Black militants. Perhaps my interviewers would never realize they were administering a loyalty test, end quote. A college senior rang comments, quote, one school refused me because they felt my recent involvement with political issues showed a lack of scholarly detachment, even though my past work was quite scholarly, end quote. The experiences of people at Illinois are representative of what was happening to teachers in colleges and universities around the country. Kangaroo Court. In September 1970, I arrived at the University of Vermont, UVM, to begin a new teaching job, only to discover that the events at Illinois were already being widely publicized in sensationalist fashion by the local right-wing newspaper, the Burlington Free Press, which rarely branded me as a violent agitator and ran letters from readers who called me un-American and a red propagandist. The following October, I returned to Illinois to stand trial for aggravated battery, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. Given a climate of opinion at Champaign County, my lawyer advised that I waive my right to a jury trial and settle for a bench trial. I reluctantly agreed, thinking that he knew better than I. The presiding judge, a reputed arch conservative named Birch Morgan, that sounds like anyway, sorry. Birch Morgan hired the testimony of two state troopers, both whom gave widely contradictory accounts of what transpired. The trooper with the chipped tooth testified that he was struck by an open hand. One cross-examination, he admitted he never saw the blow struck, but was sure I had done it while I was attempting to rise from a sitting position, a remarkable, if not impossible, way of throwing a punch. The trooper who clubbed me described me as standing upright, toe-to-toe with the injured officer, delivering a succession of blows upon him with clenched fists while he stood motionless and helpless, wearing his helmet, a face visor, and holding his riot baton. A 6'3" trooper with the chipped tooth loomed almost a head taller than I. You expect someone like Parenti, who is shorter, to be able to chip tooth of a man wearing riot gear with a visor down, with the helmet on, with his bare hand, that he managed to chip the tooth of a police officer. It's bullshit on his face. My lawyer presented 6 witnesses who described in detail my actions of that day. All of them testified that I struck no one and that I at no time resisted arrest. At the close of the trial, friends who had watched the proceedings were confident that the state had not made a case. The following day, Judge Morgan delivered the most remarkable opinion. He ignored all the conflicts in the troopers' testimonies as well as the consistencies in the testimonies of the defense witnesses. Without benefit of evidence, he implied that I must have been the instigator of the entire garbage truck incident. He observed that I had no business being there in the first place. By focusing on a few minor discrepancies in their testimony, such as whether the garbage truck was facing north or south, Morgan concluded that defense witnesses were hopelessly confused. He asserted that the most credible testimony was that of the troopers. I can't believe a state trooper would hit anyone for no reason. It seems the beating they administered to me was prima facie proof of my culpability. The trial then was merely a formality. Having proclaimed the infallibility of law enforcement agents, the judge found me guilty beyond reasonable doubt on all three counts. Many students and faculty who followed the trial closely felt that I was tried and convicted because of my highly visible political activities. I left Illinois and went to the University of Vermont to resume my teaching position. In June 1971, I returned to Illinois for sentencing because I was already employed outside the state and because a host of academic lights from around the country had sent in appeals on my behalf. I was saved from having to do time. Instead, I was given 2 years probation, a fine, in order to pay court costs. In the interim, Moranto was tried, found guilty of disorderly conduct, and sentenced to 1 year probation and court costs. Imagine if Parenti was black. He would have gotten jail time, definitely. In early 1972, at the University of Vermont, my department voted unanimously to renew my contract as the Faculty Senate Committee on Promotion and Tenure. The Council of Deans, the Vice President, and the President of the University, and I'm going to read that again, sorry. In early 1972, at the University of Vermont, my department voted unanimously to renew my contract, as did the Faculty Senate Committee on Promotion and Tenure, the Council of Deans, and the Vice President and the President of the University. But as I predicted, the UVM board of trustees, composed of affluent conservative business people, as are most of all university and college boards, and a few conservative legislators, voted 15-4 against me, citing as evidence of unprofessional conduct, my continued anti-war activities, the Illinois conviction, and the fact that I have been carrying a Viet Cong flag at a peace march in Vermont. Despite strong faculty and student support on my behalf, the Vermont trustees refused to renew my contract. This actually shows that the board of trustees at a lot of these colleges, they are definitely anti-left, and anybody who is part of the left, they refuse into the collegial spaces, the university spaces, because they're part of that class, or they're employed by the ruling class in order to gatekeep. Lawless guardians. Regarding the events described above, several observations are in order. First, while the established authorities expect others to treat regulations and procedures as invalid, they themselves are not above playing fast and loose with the rules. Witness the many unlawful acts of brutality committed by the police and the willingness of administrators like Pettleson to overlook them. Then there was Pettleson's bypassing of student faculty disciplinary committee at UI in favor of a hand-picked hearing officer, the treatment meted out to Moranto, who according to the rules, qualified for promotion because of his exceptional capabilities as scholar and teacher. The suspension of teaching assistant contracts and the bypassing of qualified but politically bothersome graduate students and the many other politically motivated hiring and firing practices encountered throughout the profession. There were other things. Not long after radical students at UI won control of the student government in an election against two competing slates and an openly professed radical platform, student government found certain of its supplies and funds cut off. When some UI students attempted to establish a non-disruptive dialogue with workers by leafletting in front of the Magnavox factory in Urbana and received a surprisingly sympathetic response from employees passing through the gate, they were run off the street by police under threat of arrest for disorderly conduct and disrupting traffic. Thus, peaceful and orderly activities, as well as disruptive ones, were suppressed. So they were really expressing solidarity and help to the workers. And who came in to disrupt that? Well, why not? The police, right? This is how it always does. Police are typically used to disrupt anything that is more pro-worker, pro-proletariat actions that threaten the power of the powers that be. Students stopped delivery trucks approaching on the UI campus and, in the best tradition of trade unionism, persuaded the first two incoming truck drivers to honor the picket line. They then were forcibly dispersed, clubbed, and arrested by police who follow their own traditions in such manners. At no time did the striking students seek to block any other student from going to class. Pickets, teach-ins, liberation classes, and spontaneous discussions were the various means utilized by radical activists to reach their fellow students, and with much success. The coercion came from the other side, the police, who were constantly resorted to excessively and unnecessary force from unsympathetic faculty who deliberately scheduled examinations during the strikes and threatened absent students with failure, and from administrators who suspended and expelled strike leaders and gave the police carte blanche to be as brutal as they chose. Dialogue, persuasion, and appealing to the minds of others, then, are all very well until such tactics began to generate real support for the dissenters, which brings us back to what I call my iron law of bourgeoisie politics. When change threatens to rule, then the rules are changed. Ron DeSantis claimed that he was a fan of free speech until free speech threatened what he wanted to be done in the state. So then he made it harder to protest. See? It's all good until it threatens your power. Then you got to change the rules, even though it's free speech. See? That's how they do. How do we get the guardians to abide by the law and order when they profess that they profess to uphold? In a widely publicized book that celebrated obedience to the law and won the kudos of mainstream critics, Abe Fortas wrote in one neglected passage that, like everyone else, the police are, quote, subject to the rule of law, and if they exceeded the authorized bounds of firmness and self-protection and needlessly assaulted the peoples whom they encountered, they should be disciplined, tried, and convicted. It is deplorable truth that because they are officers of the state, they are frequently escape the penalty for their lawlessness, end quote. They escape the penalty because the institutional elites whose rule they buttress are not only uncritical of police, but they seemingly support it. But they escape the penalty because of the institutional elites who rule, but they buttress not only uncritical police, abuse, but seemingly supportive of it. Indeed, as Peddleson demonstrated, they can be downright congratulatory. Those who are those who are quiescent and conformist on their political views and actions, yet fear they might have their liberties taken away by a backlash repression, have mistaken notion of how repression works. They will almost always be left unhampered when enunciating ideologically safe opinions and theories and remaining inconspicuously inactive. Contrary to Orwell's 1984, a book that long enjoyed an undeserved authority on this question, the state had no interest in hounding obedient, compliant citizens. If acquiescence to injustice is the freedom some people seek, they will always be free. They suffer no repression because they repress themselves, refusing to sign protest statements or join controversial organizations or get involved in any manner except to accept whatever is handed to them or engage in a sit-in. They never dream of marching in picket line or demonstrating or engaging in a sit-in or burning their draft cards or refusing to pay taxes. And they are careful that none of their opinions might get them into difficulties with future employers or public authorities. It's called not wanting to shake the apple cart, to tip over the apple cart. So they bend to the will of the powers that be, because they may say something quietly like, oh my God, I disagree with this. But when it comes to actually truly fighting against the system, they're sheepish. Now, from this, I want you to think about some commentators in the left space who refuse to actually challenge power because they don't want to lose money, because they want the access to certain politicians. I want you to think about them. They don't want to challenge that power. And so because of that, they keep us within the status quo. They keep their listeners into hearing the status quo all the time. And so their listeners don't hear anything different. They don't hear that they can challenge power and they can do it successfully, and that they actually they can do it and actually have the power to do it, and it's within their right. They suffer no repression because they repress themselves. Refusing to sign protest statements or join controversial organizations or get involved in any manner except whatever is handed to them. They never dream of marching. Okay, I already read this. Sorry. Unsurprisingly, from the Vietnam era to the present, those academics most fearfully anticipating the backlash of tomorrow have tended to give less than adequate attention to the repression of today. They counsel that the best way to preserve our freedom of movement is to be still. But the freedoms of speech and protest are best secured when most vigorously utilized by masses of people. The freedom of quietude is no freedom at all. Yet in all periods of political struggle, there are those who urge that self-policing is the best way to remain free. It is certainly a good way to remain in one's profession. Aftermath. In the years after Illinois and Vermont, I was unable to procure a regular teaching position, except for a 2-year stint in an experimental program with a leftist bent at the State University of New York, Albany, which was obliterated because of fiscal exigencies. Much is made in academia, research, and scholarship. Publish or perish is the Academy's slogan. For me, it was dissenting scholars and a new category applied: publish and perish. I have published 10 books and about 150 articles, a number of them in leading political science journals. I have a PhD from Yale glowing recommendations from two former presidents of American Political Science Association and from other prominent members of the profession, a top evaluations as a classroom teacher. Yet, over the next 20 years, I was turned down for positions at over 100 colleges and universities, passed over in many instances in favor of less qualified but politically safe and active candidates, often by departments whose entire membership collectively had not published as much as I. Every time, time and again, I heard from sympathetic associates who were privy to recruitment procedures in their departments that I was rejected because of my leftist views and political activism. On several occasions, when a particular department manifested interest in making an offer, my candidacy was squelched by administrators. A notable instance occurred at Virginia Commonwealth University, where the political science department unanimously supported me to be chair, only to be overruled by a newly appointed dean, Elsk Smith, who summarily informed them that having a leftist for an assistant professor was one thing, but having a leftist for chairperson was unacceptable. She did not explain she did not explain to her stunned colleagues why that was so. In 1985 to 86, I was invited to teach political science for a year at Brooklyn College, CUNY. Their department chair, Morton Berkowitz, and most of the other department members were enthusiastic about having me stay on as permanent faculty member, but their efforts were to no avail. The administration refused to renew my contract even though the budgetary line was available. During this time, a close associate of mine, Professor John Lombardi, a chemist who was teaching at City College, CUNY, happened to meet a dean from Brooklyn College at a party. When Lombardi asked him why his school had chosen not to retain me, the man responded, "We found out about him." Since I had spent an entire academic year at Brooklyn College on good terms with my colleagues and students, I presumed that what the administration found out was of a political nature. The very last academic position I had ever applied for was almost comical in its aspects. In June 1993, after I moved to Berkeley, California, an acquaintance associated with the Institute for the Study of Social Change at the University of California suggested that I apply for affiliation. In my letter, I pointed out that I was requesting neither salary nor office space, and I just wanted a link with scholars whom I could occasionally share ideas and information. As its name indicates, this particular institute had a reputation for progressive views. But would they take on someone who was so visibly engaged in ideological combat with the powers that be? It was not until 10 weeks later that I received a reply from the Institute's director, Troy Duster. Because of the continued budgetary crisis, he wrote, there were no support resources available for additional affiliates. He conveniently overlooked the fact that I had requested an affiliation that will cost the Institute nothing in support resources. To ask for almost nothing and to get not even that, such was my last attempt at attending a position in academia. The experiences I have described above are hardly personal to me. There are scores of other highly qualified teachers and scholars who could write autobiographical case histories of political discrimination. They are part of a larger pattern of purges conducted in the free and open academy by those who profess a dedication to democracy and academic freedom while practicing political repression. Footnote reads, for an analysis of other instances, see my Against Empire, Chapter 10. Back to the paragraph. In the end, I created a career of my own, concentrating on my writing and lecturing, reaching larger audiences than I would had I ended up with tenure and full teaching load. It was Virginia Woolf who said it was terrible to be frozen out of sacred tradition, but even more terrible to be frozen into it. Man, oh man, that was interesting. But he made a name for himself as being someone who was against the powers that be. And because of that, he was gatekeeped. He was locked out. And so this basically shows that even in college and university spaces, the left is locked out. So when people want to tell you, oh, this is a leftist space because you're in college, that's not the case. It is very rare to see somebody who is on the left. And by left, I'm not talking about progressive. I'm talking about actual left. I'm talking about anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist left. People being in those spaces and being able to be successful. It's unusual. And so this is why it is important for us to continue this education work, and even outside of the space. This is why I'm reading books like this and the autobiography of Assata Shakur, so that you guys can see this. Because guess what? You're not going to hear about these things within these spaces because they don't want you to hear about it. This is why I asked you guys to like the stream. Have you liked the stream yet? Have you subscribed? Because this is what I talk about. These are the things that I'm literally learning in front of you. So this is one of the reasons why this is so important, because we learn literally fighting against a corporate algorithm that just does not want these types of ideals to be learned about how you have more power than you realize, and that you actually have a right to wield this power. So, yeah. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for the patrons on Patreon, Coffee, the members, as well as anybody who sends me any type of mutual aid. If you guys would like to, that's also in the description below. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you and Happy New Year to every single one of you who are watching this before midnight. And also be sure to watch me as I am going to be on KRTD. I'm going to be with Sabby as well tonight. I'll be having some interesting discussions to bring in the new year. So I hope to be with you guys soon. Thank you so very much. Water your plants, water yourselves. Happy New Year. Mwah, mwah. 2 forehead kisses for every single one of y'all, because why not? And keep on reading, folks.